With COVID infections on the rise, a new push to get the facts of the virus to those most in danger. And with the elections behind us, many are looking ahead to the coming legislative session. What will be the hot topics this year? Plus, races that prove the point your vote matters. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.
This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Even as counts and recounts of the presidential election continue across the nation, we finally got some results this week in some very tight races here in Kansas. Races that came down to sometimes just a handful of votes. LA's 3 statehouse candidates had to wait more than a week to find out the results of their races. Representative Jason Probst from Reno County is headed back to Topeka with just a 31-vote win over John Weitzel for the District 102 House seat. With that win, Probst remains the westernmost Democrat in Kansas. In Johnson County, 2 other Democrats survived similarly tight races, with Jennifer Day topping Terry Frederick for the District 48 seat in the Kansas House by just 62 votes. And in District 16, Linda Featherston held on to just a 67-vote win over Richard Young. The results of these races all came down to those provisional ballots, which are counted last in any election. Ballots where someone forgot to bring their ID or went to the wrong polling site, for example, and election workers have to figure out if the ballot is valid before counting it. Tight races also raise questions about just how accurate the many electronic voting machines in Kansas are. That's why the state runs random audits to make sure the numbers match up. But 8 counties still use older voting machines that don't provide a paper trail, something one Kansas senator wants to change.
No way to go back and audit it to find out if what the machine is telling you how someone voted versus how they actually voted. Every voter should have the comfort and understanding that when they place that vote into that machine, that is a true and accurate depiction of how they voted.
Senator Richard Hildebrand says he plans to reintroduce a bill in January that would require those counties to update their electronic voting machines. And a lot to be said about the value of a vote this year. Joining me here to say it, we have Phil Journey, former state senator, current district court judge, and by Zoom, we also have Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political scientist from Friends University. And Russell, I'm going to start with you. Just how unusual is it to have this many races that were this close? I mean, usually there's 1 or 2 statewide, but it seems like there were more this year.
So one of the things that made this unusual, not just in Kansas, but also nationwide, was that you had a simultaneous motivation of the base. You had both Republicans reaching out and activating low propensity Republicans, rounding up all the voters they could find. You had Democrats that were doing the same thing. And in fact, because of the enormous amount of money that was generated, particularly on the Democratic side, in some ways, you occasionally had Democrats helping the Republicans with their job when they were just absolutely flooding the zone with more money to spend on advertising and door knocking than ever before. They were able to pull out a lot of voters that maybe hadn't participated in several cycles in the hopes that they would turn out to be Democratic voters. As it happens, a lot of them turned out to be Republican voters. And so with a high turnout on both sides, you see a lot of races that in the past, we'd seen those election cycles in those districts. We knew what to expect. Instead, we see the unexpected. We see large numbers of voters that hadn't been counted on. The fact that here in Kansas, where Republicans outnumber Democrats, the fact that they broke mostly for the Republican isn't in itself surprising. What is surprising is to see that these races that, as I said, in the past had seemed somewhat predictable and somewhat settled, really come down to the wire. And that's been especially the case in cities across Kansas, here in Wichita and elsewhere.
Well, and Phil, what are your thoughts on this so far?
Well, I heard a Republican National Committee member explain that just before the election, the Republicans found 5 million voters nationwide that were either not registered to vote or, as he said, were low propensity. They were identified, and of course they probably had some coattails too, bringing family and friends along with them to increase the registration. Then we also had a ground game for Get Out the Vote effort that was over 1 million volunteers in the Republican Party nationwide that were out there knocking on doors and making phone calls and making sure voters turned out. This is the third election cycle that national polling has been off so far outside the margin of error that it brings into question the methodology and its accuracy, and then in turn its value, because it basically looks like it's only a tool to depress someone's vote because they say they're going to lose anyway, when in fact, it doesn't turn out that way.
Now, you and I were talking a little bit before the show. We have actually seen occasional races where it is a dead heat tie and they have to pull a name from a hat.
That's right.
As somebody who's taking office from a tight race like this, does it change how you do the job?
I think it changes their colleagues' perception of them. If someone has a very close race, they know they're vulnerable and they'll try to pull them a little farther than perhaps they should go on some topics. Legislators and legislative candidates tend to be the most vulnerable the first time they run for re-election because they've either made a mistake, because they don't know how the process works, or they misread their district, or they simply don't gain the name recognition they need to get reelected.
Now, both you and Russell talked about the number of Republican voters getting out and affecting how tight these races are. But in this case, all three of the tight races we talked about, and I know there were more across the state, these were the three that I found headlines for, but all three of these were Democrats who won. Is this simply because their districts are more Democratic?
I don't think it's necessarily that they're more Democratic, though obviously those different districts are more Democratic than, say, some district out in western Kansas. I think that we have seen this election cycle in Kansas a level of Democratic, ground game campaigning that we haven't seen in many years. And this is entirely due to Barbara Bollier. The amount of money that she was able to bring in was simply unprecedented for a statewide Democratic candidate. And she used that money really, really effectively. As I said, they really wanted to target every single voter, particularly voters that they suspect to be moderate Democrats who maybe hadn't voted in a while. If there was reason to believe by looking at the exit polling data and looking at the precinct demographics that there's probably X number of Republican voters here that 4 cycles ago cast a vote, but they hadn't cast a vote for a while. They thought to themselves, well, these were probably people that were turned off during the Brownback years. These were people that we could activate and we could get to flip over to the Democratic side. Obviously, that was not terribly effective. It was effective enough for these candidates that you mentioned, but let's also keep in mind that the balance of power in the legislature in Topeka has switched. Republicans had a better year than Democrats. Even if we see a few Democrats squeaking out wins, there were a fair number of others that didn't manage that.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up this election, many state lawmakers are already looking ahead to what they hope to see out of the next session that starts in January. That includes some old topics that died early this year due to the pandemic. Now, one that was a big deal last year, medical marijuana and possibly legalizing it. Rebecca Chung with the KSN Capitol Bureau takes a look at the chances that topic will be back this year.
Kansas lawmakers are not convinced about marijuana.
There's a stigma with it. And it's very, very unfortunate because it does do a lot of good things with people.
Ken Hausler is a veteran and an owner of CBD Nation. The store offers CBD gummies, pills, and topical treatments for depression, anxiety, and chronic pain. CBD is used by people across the state as a form of alternative medicine. CBD is legal in Kansas. Here, it's made from hemp, which means it doesn't contain the hallucinogenic components of marijuana. The products at CBD Nation have helped treat thousands of people in Kansas and across the nation. Some people say marijuana could have similar medical properties, but no bill calling for its legalization has made it past committee floor. Some lawmakers have pushed for legalized pot to help solve state budget problems. Representative Gail Finney from Wichita, who introduced a bill on legalizing medical marijuana in 2009, says some lawmakers didn't take her efforts seriously.
They would joke with me and like, oh, Rep. Finney just want to eat some chips, smoke weed and eat chips.
Finney also says one of her main opponents was law enforcement. Despite efforts to legalize marijuana in more than 36 states, it's received pushback from Kansas law enforcement officials who've linked it to an increased number of people being chemically impaired. Since 2009, when the bill was turned down, Finney says more people have changed their mind about marijuana. Now that there's more widespread acceptance of marijuana across the state, with one poll showing more than 60% of Kansans in support of legalizing the drug, some lawmakers are making a solid push for it this year.
We will be having the debate again, and hopefully we'll have what I call a serious debate about it.
This time around, legislators in favor of legalizing marijuana hope that their efforts will have a lasting impact. I'm Rebecca Chung.
Now, as we look at this last election, we had several states that approved legalizing marijuana on plebiscites, but the Kansas legislature actually got more conservative. Does it really have any chance this year?
Well, and yeah, one of the other plebiscites I thought was interesting was Oregon decriminalized everything, from meth down to cocaine. And I'm going like, well, we'll see how that one goes. About 18 months ago, I attended a symposium in Denver, of course, about marijuana legalization. I was the only government official from Kansas. It was very informational. They had individuals there from about 7 different states that represented the agricultural sector, the banking sector, commerce, and revenue. And the takeaway that I got from there is that the promises of a revenue stream are all pie in the sky, that if Kansas does not go out there and take what Denver or what Colorado has done and emulate that, then we'll be doomed to reinventing the wheel and making the mistakes several other states have made. In ag, they have to make sure they don't spray the wrong pesticide on it. In commerce, they have to make sure that it will work financially. And, you know, there have been some movements in some jurisdictions where, you know, the licenses are handed out based on a quota system. Then with banking, of course, you still have the federal banking rules to deal with. And so you end up with people working in all cash, which has its own set of problems too. And then while the Denver chief of police said they haven't seen a lot of crime increases, they did see specifically targeted crime, particularly on robbery, as they're trying to get the proceeds to the deposit window. So, you know, it's full of problems, and the bill has to be well drafted for it to have a chance. I don't see it going anywhere unless someone does an awful lot of homework.
Russell, agree or disagree on that?
I would disagree, but only slightly. I mean, Phil is obviously correct that you know, there's no possibility that, you know, Kansas is going to try to become an Oregon in terms of broad legalization. Anybody who is serious about marijuana legalization or just decriminalization has a tremendous amount of work to do. I do think, however, that marijuana legalization or marijuana decriminalization is not quite as deeply embedded in our nationalized ideological struggles. You know, we talk about Medicaid expansion, which Laura Kelly, you know, made a priority when she ran for governor. And, you know, she ran into brick walls her first 2 sessions, and she's going to probably continue to run into brick walls. I see no reason to think that things have got any easier when it comes to Medicaid expansion, because it is, among other things, so very, very easy for Republicans and their primary voters that support them to see Medicaid expansion as part of, you know, this problem of the government takeover of medicine, or, you know, socialism that is a big issue for them. I just don't think there's as much negative feeling. I don't think there's as much automatic suspicion about marijuana legalization or decriminalization as there is about some other things. You know, so yes, our legislature is going to be more conservative than before. It's going to be really difficult for Laura Kelly to move ahead. I actually think that there is possibilities of movement on the marijuana front in a way that there may not be possibilities in some other areas.
Well,
you know, the referendum passed Wichita to decriminalize it. We've seen some efforts, I remember when I was in the legislature, Bob Steffen was up there advocating for medical marijuana. And I think as an interim step, I think perhaps some sort of medical marijuana is probably far more likely than simply legalization like we've seen from other states.
Sure. Yes.
The level of regulation that we've seen on the CBD products has not been sufficient, and they're relying on testing of other states to determine whether the products don't have any THC in them or not.
All right. Well, that is one thing when it comes to the legislature, we're just going to have to watch and see what happens. Another topic we could see back in Topeka this year, revamping the state's suspended driver's licensing laws. Lawmakers were on the verge of making changes last February in the wake of a Cake News investigation, and then the pandemic hit. In October of 2019, the state of Kansas reported more than 213,000 suspended driver's licenses in the state, roughly half of them in Sedgwick County alone. Lawmakers told us that most of those drivers get behind the wheel anyway, causing all of our insurance to be more expensive. The Criminal Justice Reform Commission just this week made 2 requests from state lawmakers. One, that as long as a driver is paying off their fines and fees, the state automatically give the driver a restricted license to help them keep being able to go to work. And if they have several citations, say like driving without insurance, speeding, and running a stop sign, they should only pay once to get their license reinstated instead of paying a fee for every citation. Sedgwick County Commissioner Jim Howell is among those pushing for changes to this law.
Right now, the fees rack up so quickly that when someone gets down that rabbit hole, they can never get back out. And that's the problem. So we need to throw our weight behind this because this has been a festering issue for many, many years, and it's actually getting worse.
Now, lawmakers were looking at 3 different bills last year that would have dealt with these issues and others surrounding suspended licenses, but they'll have to start over from scratch this January. And as we look at this issue, Phil, this is one you have been deeply involved with. In fact, we interviewed you for that original investigative piece. As we look at this, the changes that were proposed last year, in the form it was making its final way through the legislature, had support of county leaders, had support of activists, had support of law enforcement. So pretty good chance it'll make it through this year?
I certainly hope it will. Of all the things that we could do in the legislature could do for the people of Kansas, I think this one would touch more lives than almost anything except maybe the budget. The reality is that I've worked on this issue for over a decade, probably closer to 2. And I'm glad to see the county commissions on board. I think that they have the ability through their efforts to affect policy changes in the state legislature. We've gotten different bits and pieces done. For example, reduced fees so they could get to and from work licenses. Excuse me. And then we've also worked on ways to get work licenses and to try to at least get them on mopeds. And it's been a piecemeal progress. The mechanics of how it operates in state government is so complicated. You end up with the executive and the judicial branch involved. And the judicial branch really doesn't like the executive running in and telling them what to do. And so that has been a roadblock. And so I think it was great that the Supreme Court has created the commission and reinvented the wheel. And I just want it to start rolling.
All right. Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Turning to the pandemic now, the number of infections across the state continued to rise this last week. In response, many counties put into place tighter restrictions, from capping group sizes at 15 people to mandating masks, even closing gym locker rooms. Cake's Morgan Mobley and I took a look at the changes here in Sedgwick County.
It's game night for Levi Thornton at this restaurant in the Delano district.
This board game group used to be like 30 plus people, and now it's down to like 5-10. So now I think it's going to scare more people away from the group.
Thornton is disappointed that tighter restrictions are being placed on Sedgwick County. But County Health Director Dr. Mins says this is absolutely necessary.
Our numbers are climbing at an alarming rate, as fast as they've ever climbed, and the numbers are higher than they ever have been.
Mins issued a new local health order that's set to begin Wednesday. It includes an earlier curfew of 11 p.m. for any business serving alcohol and a 50% capacity limit for them, as well as retail stores and fitness centers. And this order will be enforced.
We'll set up a mechanism where they can notify the health department that would then trigger us sending a letter of warning.
How the enforcement works will be up to each individual city. Wichita Mayor Brandon Whipple has already begun conversations about what it'll look like here.
First, we have to come up with an agreement on enforcement when it comes to the county, how we want to work with them. And then also we have to have a resolution which will be voted on by the council to allow them to come in and do enforcement in our city.
For businesses that are in defiance, the fine amount could be up to $500. Whipple says no matter the cost, it's time to take this seriously.
We're seeing cities and countries around the world that actually start shutting down at this point. This is really the last effort we have right now.
I didn't know that until today.
Carrie Macy likes coming to Planet Fitness to work up a sweat, but had to change her routine when she came in on Thursday. The locker room she usually changes in was closed. She was able to change in the bathroom.
I just put my stuff in my car and locked it.
We've had some people that were upset about it, yes. And we've had a couple people get a little irritated about it. But they're understanding more so this time.
The gym's owner, Ian Cunningham Osterman, told us he wasn't really surprised by the county's order to shut down the locker rooms, not after watching the rising number of COVID infections in Sedgwick County. He doesn't expect the closure to make much of a difference in his business.
Even since the beginning of the pandemic and the shutdown, stuff like that, not as many people congregated in the locker rooms and changing.
But it might help. He's hoping the measure can slow the spread of the virus and maybe prevent another COVID shutdown this winter, something he'd rather avoid. So would Carrie.
It's a little bit of an inconvenience. I mean, it'd be easier just to use the lockers, but again, if it's safer and it can keep the gyms open, then that's what we want, so we can work out.
Now we're dealing with fewer restrictions right now than we saw last spring when we went into that shutdown in March. Fewer complaints, it seems like at the moment, Russell. Is that just exhaustion because we've just kind of reached the point of whatever, I'll deal? Or is it fear of another shutdown and it's like, okay, let's do what we can now to avoid that?
I would like to believe that it's a function of people recognizing internally the stakes that we're facing in terms of long-term economic impacts, to say nothing of health impacts. I also think that there's exhaustion involved, as well as, let's be clear about this, confusion. It was a really important part of the report that you all put together to address the questions of enforcement, because that is fundamentally what it is all going to revolve around. We know that there are people that will disregard the various mandates. How do you address that? Who is going to be responsible for that? Do we allow individual businesses to do that? But if that results in really, really spotty and inconsistent enforcement, what government steps in for this? Mayor Whipple, I think, was really correct to talk about the need to work closely with the county to try to develop a resolution where there would be a unified enforcement policy. You might recall that one of the big sources of disagreement between the county and the city originally here in Sedgwick was that the county was not willing to follow through fully on the state mandate that came out of Governor Kelly's office, while you had the city council agreeing to support that mandate. To the degree that you can get all the government bodies on the same page, sending out a consistent message, then you're going to get more response from the individual organizations and businesses in terms of themselves.
Russell, I'm going to jump in there because just in the last 24 hours before we recorded this episode, we had state leaders, the governor as well as state lawmakers, saying we're going to get together and put out this public relations campaign trying to get people to wear masks and do other social distancing aspects. Is that the leadership that we need at this point?
Statistically, it's clear that if everyone wears masks, lives will be saved. Last week, 1 in 400 Americans tested positive. That means 1 in 100 are shedding viruses as we speak. The reality is that the vaccines won't be here for a year. And also, there's a lot of exhaustion out there. And there's still a lot of denial. It's hard to believe. Hospitals are refusing transfer requests from Western Kansas now. They're already too full. I'm really concerned that in the 2 to 4 weeks we have from today, we'll start looking an awful lot like Italy did in the spring.
Yeah. Well, and that is not something that anybody wants. And it's really one of the biggest dangers to minority communities, especially African-American communities here in Kansas, with more than 30% of coronavirus-related deaths in Kansas coming from the African-American community. The Wichita Council of Elders is launching a new campaign to get the word out on how to stay safe. They're calling it the Fact Not Fear campaign. And Tijuana Hardwell is joining us to explain a little bit more about it. Tijuana, let's start off. What are the goals of this campaign and how do you hope to get there?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. The biggest goal that we have is to make sure that we're getting messaging and communication out there to encourage people in the community to make sure that they're listening to, wearing masks, making sure that they're sanitizing their hands, and of course, social distancing. It's so very important to make sure as best as we can that we're not doing these big gatherings, coming together as a big group of people, which is of course really difficult because the holidays are coming up. So.
What do you think is the biggest need in the African American and other communities of color when it comes to this pandemic? Is it the basics of getting masks and getting information, or is it the fact that so many of them are in those frontline jobs right now?
I think, in my opinion, the biggest issue had been just making sure that communication comes from people who look like them. I do think that there's just been a distrust in the community for years. This dates back just historically. And so making sure that we get that communication out there is something that is really important. So making sure, of course, that we connect our people to resources and the information that they're needing in a timely manner. And so I do think that helps. It helps to have people who look like you affirming for you just the importance of this, how important it is, but also other things that they're able to do, connecting them to resources and information also.
All right. Well, very quickly, how long is this campaign expected to run? And if somebody wants to help out, what can they do?
Yes. So the African American Council of Elders is the recipient of CARES Act funding. And so this campaign is slated to continue through December 30th. But I can tell you right now that with the numbers going up, this is something that may actually be extended. We do realize how important it is what we're doing to make sure that we get that messaging and communication out there. Of course, connecting them to masks. The African American Council of Elders, along with the Black Alliance, has been responsible for distributing thousands of masks for free at no charge to people in the community, just because we realize how important it is to make sure that barrier is not there. So anyone wanting a mask can make sure that they get a mask.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tijuana Hardwell, for joining us. I hope that you, as well as our audience, have found these discussions helpful. We'd love to hear what you think. Reach out to us on social media at Pilar Pedraza TV or KPTS Channel 8, and let's keep the conversation going. We'd also like to extend a thank you to our media partners at KSN News, Cake News, and the Wichita Eagle. For now, stay safe and have a great week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.